December 16th, 1944. 2:47 p.m. American Captain Robert Mitchell froze behind his cover. Through his binoculars, he observed something that defied his understanding of military logic. The German bunker at the crossroads, which his company had been trying to storm for 6 hours, was still firing. 12 men were already dead, 18 wounded. And after every lull in the firing, when they thought the defender must be dead or out of ammunition, the MG-42 would once again unleash its deadly hammering. Mitchell grabbed his radio. His voice was rough, incredulous. "How many Germans are in that damn bunker?" The answer would shatter him. After the war, when he read the German documents, he would learn what he couldn't believe at that moment. There was only one, a single German sergeant, alone, for 48 hours. Against an entire American infantry company. This is the story of Sergeant Paul Schaefer, 32 years old, from Cologne. A machine gun specialist with the 12th Volksgrenadier Division. A man who, in the early hours of December 16th, 1944, made a decision that was described in American war diaries as impossible. To understand this story, we must go back 18 hours, to the moment when it all began. December 15th, 1944, 8:30 p.m. The Eifel region, Belgium. Snow fell heavily across the landscape. Sergeant Schaefer sat in Bunker 8, a small concrete bunker overlooking a strategic crossroads. Beside him were 3 other soldiers. Private Miller, 19 years old, only 2 weeks at the front. Lance Corporal Weber, 27, a veteran from North Africa, and Private First Class Schmidt, 22, a quiet man from Bavaria who constantly carried a photo of his fiancée in his breast pocket. The 4 men had only known each other for 3 weeks. The division was newly formed, full of replacements and young recruits, but Schaefer was different. He had experienced Poland, France, Russia. 3 years on the Eastern Front had taught him that survival was a matter of preparation and discipline. He insisted that the bunker be perfectly organized, ammunition crates stacked and numbered, spare barrels for the MG-42 laid out, hand grenades in designated positions, water containers filled, emergency rations checked. Weber had joked, "Schaefer, we're only staying here for a week. You're setting up like we're staying for a year." Schaefer hadn't smiled. "In Russia, I learned, be prepared for everything, or you die surprised." At 10:15 p.m. the order came over the radio. The offensive would begin the next morning. Their task was simple: hold the crossroads as long as the main forces advanced. After that, they would be relieved. Schaefer nodded. He ordered the men to sleep in shifts. He himself took the first watch. What he didn't know, what no one knew, was that the crossroads they were guarding was marked on American maps as a critical fallback route, that their position would become the focal point of desperate fighting in 18 hours, that he, Paul Schaefer from Cologne, would soon be standing completely alone. December 16th, 1944. 5:30 a.m. The sky was still dark when the German artillery began. The ground shook. Schaefer woke the men. They took their positions. The MG-42 was loaded, secured, ready. They could do nothing but wait. At 6:15 a.m., they heard it. Engines, tanks, infantry. But the sounds weren't getting closer to their bunker. They were moving north, towards the main line. Schaefer understood. They were the flank protection, the insurance. If the Americans tried to encircle the advancing troops, this bunker would have to stop them. Hours passed. 7 coups a.m., 8 East a.m., 9 East a.m. Nothing. Only the distant thunder of fighting to the north. Miller was nervous. His hands were trembling slightly. Schaefer noticed it. He spoke calmly. "Miller, double-check the ammunition. Count every crate." The boy nodded, grateful for a task. At 11:45 a.m., Weber saw them first. Movement on the road about half a mile away. Schaefer grabbed his binoculars. American infantry, at least a company, maybe more. They were moving cautiously, using cover. They didn't know exactly where the bunker was. Not yet. Schaefer ordered absolute silence. Nobody moves, nobody breathes loudly. We let them get closer. Weber asked quietly, "How close?" Schaefer answered, 200 yards, and then we opened fire. The Americans advanced, 600 yards, 500 yards, 400 yards. Schaefer could see their faces. Young men, some were smiling. They thought the resistance was broken, that the Germans were retreating. They had no idea that 4 men in a concrete bunker were watching them, 300 yards. Schaefer put his hand on the MG-42. His voice was ice cold. "Ready?" Weber and Schmidt took up rifles. Miller held hand grenades. 250 yards, 200 yards. Schaefer squeezed the trigger. The MG-42 was known for its rate of fire, 200 rounds per minute. The Americans called it Hitler's buzzsaw because of the tearing, continuous sound. In the first 3 seconds, Schaefer had fired 60 rounds. The first row of Americans collapsed. Men fell, screaming, desperately seeking cover. Weber and Schmidt fired controlled single shots. Miller threw 2 hand grenades into a group gathering behind a fallen tree. The explosions sent snow and earth flying. The first attack lasted 7 minutes. As the Americans retreated, 14 of their comrades lay in the snow. 4 weren't moving. 10 were screaming for help. Schaefer held his fire. He wasn't a monster. The wounded were no threat. What happened next would set the tone for the next 48 hours. The Americans tried to recover their wounded. Schaefer let them. Weber asked, "Why aren't we firing?" Schaefer answered, "Because we're soldiers, not murderers. Let them get their men." But when the Americans tried to advance further under the cover of this rescue operation, Schaefer opened fire again. The message was clear: get your wounded, but don't try to outflank us. The American commander understood. 2 men recovered the wounded. The rest retreated. It was 12:17 p.m. The first fight was over. Schmidt breathed heavily. That was too easy. They'll be back, with more men. Schaefer nodded. "I know. Check the ammunition, change the barrel, drink water. They'll be back in an hour." He was right. At 1:45 p.m. the second attack began. This time there were more. At least 60 Americans. And they had learned. They didn't come head-on. They tried to attack from 2 sides simultaneously. Schaefer had anticipated this. The bunker had firing ports in 3 directions. He and Weber took the left flank, Schmidt on the right. Miller loaded ammunition belts and hurled grenades through the embrasures. The MG-42 hammered. Pause. It swiveled. Hammered again. The Americans pressed forward, but every meter cost them men. After 10 minutes, they retreated again. This time, they left 8 more fallen behind, but something had changed. Captain Schaefer noticed it immediately. During the retreat, the Americans had set up mortar rounds. He yelled, "Take cover! Get down!" The first round hit 20 meters in front of the bunker. The second, 15 meters to the right. They were zeroing in. The third struck the outside of the bunker. The concrete walls held, but the noise in the small room was deafening. Dust fell from the ceiling. Miller's nose bled from the overpressure. 6 rounds fell, then silence. Schaefer knew what that meant. They had located the bunker. Now, they would come with everything they had. 2:30 p.m. The third assault. This time, the Americans combined everything: mortar fire, machine gun fire for suppression, infantry advancing under that cover, smoke grenades to conceal their movements. Schaefer fought methodically, short, precise bursts of fire. He wasted no ammunition. He targeted movements in the smoke, muzzle flashes, shadows. Weber was everywhere, helping where needed. Schmidt fired with iron composure. Miller, his face covered in dust and sweat, passed ammunition as fast as his hands could move. This assault lasted longer, almost 20 minutes. The Americans got within 50 meters, so close that Schaefer could see their faces. A sergeant yelling at his men to push forward. A young private crying as he crawled ahead. An officer with a pistol leading his men. Schaefer aimed at the officer, not out of hate, out of tactical necessity. The officer fell. The American line faltered. A moment of confusion. Schaefer seized it. A long burst across the entire line. The Americans broke, retreated. This time, in a panic. This time, they left everything behind. 3 p.m. Silence. Schaefer checked his men. Miller was unharmed, but in shock. His eyes stared blankly. Weber had a light flesh wound on his arm, where a stone fragment had hit him. Schmidt was calm as always, but Schaefer saw something in his eyes. Something hard, something born in war. Schaefer ordered a break. They ate emergency rations, drank water. Nobody spoke. What was there to say? They were still alive. Their enemies weren't. And in an hour, it would start all over again. The 4th assault came at 4:20 p.m. and the 5th at 5:45 p.m. As dusk began to settle, each time the same pattern: mortar fire, infantry advance, MG-42 response, American retreat. But the Americans were learning, they were becoming more cautious, more skillful, and there were more of them. At 7 p.m., in almost complete darkness, they attempted a night attack without mortars, so as not to reveal their position. Silent approach. But Schaefer had flares. When he heard the first movement, Weber fired a flare. The sky became as bright as day. In front of the bunker, only 30 meters away, were at least 40 Americans trying to sneak up. The MG-42 spoke. In the ghostly light of the flare, it was like a nightmare. Men fell everywhere, screaming, crawling back. When the flare died out, the night was filled with screams. Schaefer paused. His heart hammered. He wasn't a monster, but he was a soldier. And soldiers do what has to be done. At 9:30 p.m., everything changed. It began with a sound, a high-pitched whine. Schaefer recognized it instantly. Artillery, real artillery, not mortars. The Americans had brought up heavy guns. The first salvo hit, 3 rounds. One hit 40 meters to the left, one 30 meters to the right, one directly in front of the bunker. The ground shook. The bunker trembled. Dust and small pieces of rock rained down from the ceiling. Miller screamed, not from pain, from fear. Schaefer grabbed him. "Miller, the bunker will hold. It's built for this." But the young man didn't hear. He was shaking uncontrollably. The second salvo, 4 rounds. One hit the back of the bunker, a thunderous blow. The lamp went out. In the darkness, Schaefer could only hear the heavy breathing of his men. Weber found a flashlight. In the dim light, they saw the damage, cracks in the back wall. Nothing structural, but unsettling. And worse. The radio was destroyed. A stone fragment had hit it. The screen was shattered. Wires hung out. Schmidt tried to repair it. After 10 minutes, he shook his head. "Dead. We can't call anyone." The third salvo, 6 rounds. Methodically, the Americans were working their way closer, testing the range. Soon, they would score direct hits. And then, at 10:15 p.m., the inevitable happened. A round hit directly above the front embrasure. The explosion was deafening. The pressure wave threw all 4 men to the ground. For a moment, there was absolute silence. Then, the screams began. Weber was closest to the explosion. Schaefer crawled to him. In the light of the flashlight, he saw it. A large piece of rock had hit Weber's chest, blood everywhere. Weber reached for Schaefer's hand, tried to speak. Blood ran from his mouth. Schaefer held his hand. "Quiet, friend. Quiet. We'll get you out of here." But he knew the truth. They were isolated, no radio contact, no medic would come. Weber would die here. Weber knew it too. He squeezed Schaefer's hand, tried to smile, then his grip weakened. At 10:23 p.m., his breathing stopped. Schaefer gently closed his eyes. He had seen many men die, in Poland, in France, in Russia, but it never got easier. Each time, it felt like a piece of his own soul died. He had no time to grieve. The fourth salvo came, and the fifth. The Americans now knew that they could heavily damage the bunker. They wouldn't stop until it collapsed, or they stormed it. At 11:20 p.m., Schmidt had made a decision. He stood up, his uniform covered in Weber's blood, and said calmly, "Schaefer, I'm going." Schaefer stared at him. "What?" Schmidt repeated, "I'm going. Through the back door. I'll try to get to our lines, get help." Schaefer shook his head. "That's suicide. The Americans are surrounding us." "You won't make it 50 meters." Schmidt smiled sadly. "Maybe, but if I stay, we'll all die here. If I go, I might have a chance. And if I get through, they can relieve us." The logic was undeniable, but the risk was immense. Schaefer looked into Schmidt's eyes. He saw resolve, acceptance. The man had made his choice. Captain Schaefer nodded slowly. "Go during the next artillery barrage. The noise will cover your movement." Sergeant Schmidt extended his hand. "It was an honor, Captain." They shook hands. Then they waited. At 11:17 p.m., the next barrage began. Schmidt opened the rear hatch. One last look back. Then he was gone, swallowed by the night and the noise. Schaefer would never know if Schmidt made it. After the war, he would read in records that a German soldier was shot by an American patrol that night, only 300 meters from the bunker. He would always suspect it was Schmidt. Now, there were only two of them left. Schaefer and 19-year-old Michael. The bunker was damaged. The radio, dead. One comrade had fallen. Another, likely two. And the night was still young. The hours until midnight were relatively quiet. The Americans occasionally fired mortar rounds, more to wear down the bunker than for any real tactical reason. Schaefer used the time wisely. He organized the remaining ammunition. 12 belts for the MG-42. Approximately 3,000 rounds, 4 hand grenades, half a dozen flares, 2 full water containers, emergency rations for 3 days. He glanced over at Michael. The boy was huddled in a corner, his arms wrapped around his knees. His eyes were empty. Schaefer knew that look. He'd seen it too many times, men breaking inside, even before their bodies fell. He sat down next to Michael, spoke softly. "How are you holding up?" Michael didn't answer immediately. Then, in a shaky voice, "I've never killed anyone, Captain. 2 weeks ago, I was in school, and now there are men out there, dead, because I threw grenades." Schaefer was silent for a moment. Then, "I know. It's never easy, even after years. But listen to me, Michael. Those guys out there, they'd kill us without hesitation. This is war. You didn't ask for this war. Neither did I. But we're here, and if we want to live, we have to fight." Michael looked at him. "Do you think we'll get out of here alive?" Schaefer didn't lie. "I don't know, but as long as we're breathing, we fight. Understand?" Michael nodded slowly. Schaefer clapped him on the shoulder. Then, he retook his position at the MG-42. It was 12:45 a.m., December 17th. Day 2 had begun. At 2:30 a.m., The Americans attempted their seventh attack, again, at night. This time, with more caution. They came slowly, using every bit of cover. Schaefer let them get within 40 meters before firing a flare. In the sudden light, the Americans froze. Schaefer opened fire. The MG-42 hammered. Men fell. But this time, the Americans shot back. Intensely. Bullets ricocheted off the concrete walls. Some flew through the embrasures. Michael ducked, his hands over his head. The firefight lasted only 5 minutes, but it was intense. When the Americans retreated, 3 ammunition belts were empty, and Schaefer had a bleeding graze on his temple, where a piece of shrapnel had hit him. Michael helped him bandage the wound. His hands were shaking less now. The shock was slowly giving way to reality, that he would either fight or die. And in the face of that choice, he found, like so many before him, courage he didn't know he possessed. The 8th attack came at dawn, 6:20 a.m. The Americans had received reinforcements overnight. Schaefer could count at least 100 men, and worse, they had a tank, an M4 Sherman. The sight made Schaefer's heart sink. The bunker could withstand infantry, but against a 75mm cannon. The Sherman advanced, infantry following behind it for cover. Schaefer knew if he let the tank fire, the bunker wouldn't stand a chance. He had to do something. He reached for one of the remaining hand grenades. Michael stared at him. "Captain, what are you doing?" Schaefer answered, "When the tank gets closer, I'm going to throw this through the embrasure. It's a desperate gamble, but it's all we've got." The Sherman came closer. 100 meters, 80 meters, 60 meters. Schaefer held the grenade, ready to throw. But then, unexpectedly, the tank stopped. The commander was apparently afraid to get too close to the bunker. Instead, he began firing from a distance. The first shell missed, impacting 10 meters to the right. The second hit the side of the bunker. The wall held, but large cracks appeared. The third hit the ceiling. Concrete crumbled. The end seemed near. But then, something unexpected happened. From the north, barely audible over the noise of the battle, came a new sound: German artillery. The offensive in the north had apparently pushed back the American lines, and now the German guns could reach this sector. The first German shell landed 200 meters behind the American Sherman, the second 150 meters, the third 100 meters. The American commander understood. If he stayed, his tank would become a target. He retreated, the infantry following hastily. For a brief, wonderful moment, there was silence. Schaefer and Michael looked at each other in disbelief. They had survived again, but the joy was short-lived. By 8 a.m., it was clear that the German artillery wouldn't stay. The shelling stopped. The American voices returned, louder now, angrier. They'd had enough. The 9th attack began at 9:15 a.m., this time without the Sherman, but with desperate intensity. The Americans fired everything they had: rifles, machine guns, mortars. The bunker became a hell of noise and dust and fear. Schaefer fought mechanically: load, aim, fire, load, aim, fire. Michael threw their last 2 hand grenades. The defense held, but just barely. And then, at 9:47 a.m., a mortar shell hit right next to the embrasure where Michael was standing. The explosion wasn't large, but a piece of shrapnel, small as a finger, flew through the embrasure. It struck Michael in the neck. The boy clutched at his neck. Blood poured between his fingers. He looked at Schaefer, eyes full of fear and disbelief, tried to speak, but only blood came out. Schaefer dropped the MG-42, jumped to him, tried to stop the bleeding, pressed with both hands. But he knew the carotid artery had been hit. Nothing would stop that. Michael lived for another 3 minutes. In those 3 minutes, Schaefer held his hand, spoke soothing words, lied that everything would be all right. And as Michael's eyes glazed over, as his grip weakened, as his last breath came, Schaefer was with him. Then Paul Schaefer was alone. Utterly alone, in a damaged bunker, surrounded by enemies, no radio contact, no hope of relief, limited ammunition, against an entire American company. Any reasonable man would have surrendered, would have raised a white flag, would have hoped for mercy. But Sergeant Schaefer wasn't just reasonable. He was a German sergeant, and he had an order: hold the crossroads. So he fought on, alone. The next 38 hours are documented in American reports. Captain Mitchell wrote in his war diary, "We cannot understand how this bunker is still firing. We've tried everything: direct artillery fire, tank assaults, infantry attacks day and night. Nothing works. It has to be more than one man. It's impossible for a single individual to do this." But it was just one. Schaefer fought with methodical brilliance. He had learned to conserve ammunition, short, precise bursts of fire, never more than necessary. He used the corpses of the fallen as a psychological weapon, leaving them where they lay, a macabre testament to his deadly effectiveness. He slept in short bursts, 10 minutes here, 15 minutes there, always with an ear open for movement outside. He ate sparingly, drank little. He talked to himself to keep his sanity, recited poems he had learned in school, spoke to the dead, Weber and Miller and Schmidt, as if they were still with him. The 10th attack, the 11th, the 12th, they blurred together. Day became night, became day. Schaefer lost all sense of time, existed only in the moment. Survive, fight, repeat. The Americans tried everything. They tried to starve the bunker out. But Schaefer had rations. They tried to blind him with smoke grenades, but he fired into the haze and still hit his targets. They tried to get close at night, but he had flares. Not many, but enough. Worst of all was the loneliness, the absolute crushing loneliness. In Russia, he had learned to endure cold, hunger, fear. But loneliness was different. It ate at the soul, especially in the quiet moments when there was no fire, when it was just him and his thoughts. He thought of Cologne, of his wife, Margaret, of his daughter, Anna, 7 years old. He hadn't seen them in 2 years. Would he ever see them again? Would she even remember him? Or would she, like so many children, only have a blurred image of a father who never came back from the war? December 18th, 2:30 p.m. Almost exactly 48 hours since the first attack. Schaefer's last ammunition crate was half empty, about 500 rounds left. His hands were bleeding from the hot metal parts of the MG-42. His eyes burned from lack of sleep and dust. His body screamed for rest, but his mind remained iron. Not yet. Not yet surrender, not yet fall, and then he heard it, a sound he hadn't heard in 2 days. German voices, shouts, commands, the rumble of tank treads. Schaefer dared barely to hope. He crawled to the firing slit, looked out, and there, about 400 meters away on the road to the north, he saw them. German troops, tanks, infantry. The offensive had broken through the American lines. Reinforcements were finally arriving. The Americans saw them too. Captain Mitchell gave the order to withdraw. His men had suffered enough. 39 killed in action, 57 wounded, all because of a single German bunker. It was time to go. When the German troops reached the bunker, they found Schaefer unconscious next to the MG-42, utterly exhausted, dehydrated, on the verge of collapse, but alive. They also found the bodies of Weber, Schmidt, and Müller, and they found the traces of an incredible battle, hundreds of empty shell casings, bloodstains, shrapnel, cracks in the walls, a bunker that had become one man's fortress. Paul Schaefer survived the war. He returned to Cologne, to Margaret, to Anna. He never spoke much about the bunker, about the 48 hours, about Weber, Schmidt and Müller. Some memories are too heavy to put into words, but in American archives, the record remains. Captain Mitchell's war diary, the casualty lists of his company, and a note written years after the war, when he was finally able to read the German documents. It was just one man, a single German sergeant, 48 hours, alone. I've seen many brave men in war, on both sides. But what this man did was something else. That wasn't courage, that was something superhuman, something I respect, even though he was my enemy. These aren't just statistics from dusty archives. These are the moments that decided the fate of millions. Real soldiers, real fear, real consequences. These stories must never be forgotten. If these historical truths are important to you, then support with YouTube's Super Thanks, the golden heart below. Each Super Thanks allows me to spend weeks in archives, digitizing rare documents, interviewing surviving witnesses. Help me preserve this story for generations to come. What makes a man like Paul Schaefer? What gives him the strength to fight alone for 48 hours when every ounce of reason tells him to give up? Military historians have studied this question for decades. The answer is complex. It was partly training. The German military training emphasized discipline, initiative, responsibility. Sergeants were taught to make decisions, take charge, never give up. It was partly camaraderie. Schaefer wasn't fighting for an ideology. He was fighting for the men beside him, and when they fell, he fought for their memory. It was partly duty, a simple concept, almost old-fashioned today, but powerful. The order was, hold the crossroads, and Sergeant Paul Schaefer held the crossroads. After the war, studies were conducted about the psychological effect of such defenses on attacking troops. The Americans who fought against Schaefer's bunker showed symptoms now known as combat stress, nightmares, tremors, refusal to attack again. One soldier, Private James Cooper, wrote years later, "We called him the ghost in the bunker because it seemed impossible that one human being could do that. Every time we thought he had to be dead, that damned MG-42 would fire again. It broke us, not physically, mentally. We were afraid of one man." That's the power of defense. The psychological advantage of the defender against the attacker. The Americans had to advance across open ground, had to expose themselves, had to die. Schaefer only had to aim and pull the trigger, but even with that advantage, to do what he did, alone, for 48 hours, that remains extraordinary. There's a footnote to the story, something that only came to light decades later. After the war, in 1952, Margaret Schaefer received a letter from America, from Robert Mitchell. The letter was short, but deeply emotional. Mitchell wrote that he respected the man who had been in that bunker, that despite the losses his men had suffered, he understood that Schaefer was only doing his duty, just like they all were. He wrote that the war had made them enemies, but that peace allowed them to see each other as men who had done their best under impossible circumstances. Schaefer responded, and over the years, the two men engaged in a sporadic exchange of letters, never quite friendship, but respect. The understanding between two men who had stood on opposing sides of a tragedy. Mitchell passed away in 1978. In his personal papers, his family found a folder labeled "The German in the Bunker." Inside were copies of all the reports, sketches of the defenses, and a photograph of Paul Schaefer. From a German prisoner of war camp, Mitchell had somehow acquired it after the war, and he had kept it all those years. as a reminder, not of an enemy, but of a soldier who had done his duty to the utmost. Paul Schaefer died in 1989 at the age of 77. At his funeral in Cologne, there were 3 men present whom no one recognized. Americans, veterans. They didn't introduce themselves, said nothing, but in the end, they placed 3 roses on his grave. 1 for Weber, 1 for Schmidt, and 1 for Müller. Then they left. No one asked who they were, but Margaret knew they were Mitchell's men, come to pay honor to a former foe, because sometimes, even in war, bravery transcends nationality. The story of Sergeant Paul Schaefer isn't a story of ideology or politics. It's the story of a man who was placed in an impossible situation and who, through training, duty, and sheer human endurance, did the impossible. 48 hours, alone, against an entire company. That's not propaganda. That's documented history, preserved in the archives of both nations, confirmed by eyewitnesses on both sides, and it reminds us that war, as terrible as it is, sometimes brings forth moments that showcase the limits of what humans are capable of, for better and for worse. What impressed you the most? Many viewers have shared incredible family stories. Grandfathers who were there, letters found in attics, war diaries that have survived generations. Share your family history from that time below. Every comment is a piece of history that we preserve together.